Today we're going to look at verbal abuse, um, and it sits on a spectrum with emotional abuse. And if you are experiencing extreme verbal abuse, or if things are very difficult and you feel that you're in danger, then please reach out for help. Please reach out to a charity. Please reach out to get some support because you need to take care of yourself. Um, for the purposes of this, we're going to be looking at verbal abuse in the form of yelling, shouting, and verbal put downs. As I said, it could slide on the scale into emotional abuse in the form of criticism, humiliation, and controlling behaviour. And the impact on your life can be small or it can be large. It can have a huge impact on how you experience yourself and your relationship. Maybe the verbal abuse outbursts are few and far between, or maybe it's every day, or maybe it's something that happens under a certain set of circumstances, and maybe something you experience on a regular basis. Um, the important thing to remember is that no one deserves to be on the receiving end of verbal abuse. There are healthy, kind ways for people to express themselves. And if someone's experiencing difficulties and it makes it difficult for them to express themselves in a healthy way, it doesn't mean it's okay for you to be on the receiving end of that verbal abuse. And I think often if somebody's very um, irritated, very annoyed, they can be very convincing. They can be we can think, "Oh, perhaps I've got a point. They seem so agitated with something I may have said or done. Maybe it's justifiable. Maybe I deserve it." But actually, that's not true. Just because somebody feels very strongly about something and they express it in verbally abusive ways doesn't mean they're right, and it doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means that they are not very good at expressing themselves. There are healthy, kind, loving ways for someone to express their frustration with you. It doesn't have to be in a verbally abusive format. Um, for example, if perhaps you lock the keys in the house and lock the keys in the house, somebody could come back at you with all sorts of swearing and all sorts of frustration, and it could be an opportunity for their anger to erupt out of them towards you. Or they could say, "That's really frustrating. I'm going to be late now. I'm going to have to call out a locksmith. It's making my day really difficult." They're expressing the same frustration, but they're doing it in a healthy way. And I think we can become desensitized to verbal abuse. We can get so used to people responding in a certain way that on a scale of um, frustration to really letting rip, things over time, especially in long-term relationships, even be that with a partner or be that with a colleague at work or a boss or someone who is a family member, they can become habitualized into giving themselves permission to explode. They may justify, "Oh, you're so annoying, I have to speak to you like this. It's the only way to get through to you." And these things just simply aren't true. It's not the only way to get through to somebody. It's probably the least effective way to get your point across to somebody, because when you start with a verbal abuse, the person on the receiving end goes into fight or flight. There's little scope for discussion and working things through in progress when someone is verbally abusive. When somebody does have an outburst or a tirade, be really careful not to take it too personally. As I say, it can be very convincing, and we can really think that they have a point, that there's something wrong with us, that we must be really bad if they're so annoyed, because a reasonable person would only be so annoyed if I'd done something wrong. And we have to really keep reminding ourselves that someone who chooses, and on some level they are choosing to express themselves in a verbally abusive way. They're not choosing to take a breath. They're not choosing to get some healthy perspective. They're allowing themselves just to let rip. If someone does that, we don't have to take it on. We don't have to take the criticism to heart. And oftentimes, things that are said in that degree of anger should be taken with a large pinch of salt, because given a breath, given a calming down, given a different perspective, most people would prefer to speak to you in a way that is respectful. Um, some people just can't do that. They have a very short fuse. They don't necessarily have the emotional range. They're not willing to do the work on themselves necessary to dig deep and to find alternative ways of communicating. And then we have to ask ourselves, am I okay being with someone who isn't prepared to do the work, isn't capable, hasn't got the emotional resources to do the work, isn't willing to do the work? Is that something I'm willing to put up with long term? And that's a question for later. At the moment, this course is very much about dealing with the here and now. So if you're on the receiving end of someone who is verbally abusive, the first thing is to remember, just because it's so emphatic, just because there's so much energy behind it, just because they're so convincing, doesn't necessarily mean they're right. It just means that they're not very good at expressing themselves. In your workbook today, I would suggest that you jot down maybe something that's been said to you in a moment of frustration by somebody else. You're so useless. Why do you always do this? Um, why is it that I always have to, whatever it is? And I think sometimes the verbal abuse can be move into the emotional abuse spectrum where there's personal attack, and it can feel very personal. Um, but what we're trying to understand is, just because it feels personal doesn't mean it's right. If somebody is very charged, very angry, not very good at communicating, they're going to offload their stuff. So you're often going to be hearing things that they don't like in themselves, that they project it onto you. So they get particularly annoyed about certain things because actually it's something they're not comfortable within themselves. But there's no way they're prepared to look at that at this moment. So we have to look at it. We have to go into that place of neutrality that we've been talking about over the course. Find that stillness, understand that they're speaking from a place of pain and anger and frustration. Maybe think, oh, okay, well, perhaps I could have done that differently. It's always things for us to learn, but we don't have to take on everything that's said. And I think sometimes very harsh words can be used, and we can start to doubt ourselves. They can kind of beat us down, and we can fight back, but that's kind of pointless, because somebody who's in that verbal tirade space, probably looking for a fight, they're not going to hold back. They're just going to keep going. So we can stay calm. So you're really upset by this. I'm just going to take a minute. If you're on the receiving end, leave the room. I understand you're upset at the moment. I'm willing to talk to you about this, but not while you're in this frame of mind. So coming back to the workbook, taking some examples of when um, maybe some of the things that have been said, taking a situation, for example, let's say you've locked the keys into the house, verbal abuse ensues. You write down situation, what was said, and then you write down another column how actually that could have been handled in a more adult way, how that could have been handled in a kinder way, where someone can express, yes, I'm really annoyed with you, but actually, and I'm going to be late, but I know it's not your fault. I know you didn't do it on purpose, but I'm really frustrated. Someone can get across their irritation, but in a way that's much more healthy. And I think if we practice taking an example of a situation where we've been on the receiving end of verbal abuse, jotting down a couple of things that were said, there's context, and then writing down on the other column, well, if he'd approached it slightly differently, if she'd approached it slightly differently, she could have said, I'm really annoyed with you. I understand it wasn't your problem. And then you begin to see that there are different ways that people can communicate. And just because somebody's so emphatic doesn't mean it's right. So the buzz in this situation for you to practice is, in reasonable relationship, there is no need for this. This being a verbal abuse, explosions, emotional tearing downs. In healthy relationships, there is no need for this, because in a healthy relationship, both parties can get frustrated, both parties can get irritated, but they can communicate in a way where they own, I feel really annoyed by how this is affecting me, and I would have preferred if things had been different. It's very different to the pointing, the shouting, the offload, the tirade. It's a bit like someone when they're going through a verbal abuse moment, it's as if they're vomiting over us their toxicity, their pain, their suffering, all the negativity that's in their head gets erupted out and kind of vomited. So if we could see it as an act of them releasing some pain and toxicity with absolutely no relation to us whatsoever, because in a healthy relationship, there are other ways of communicating. If we can see those tirade outbursts as something that sits with them, they want to make it our problem. They want it to be about us because they don't want to look at themselves. And maybe they're not going to be ready. And as I say, maybe in time you have to make a decision about whether long term this is a place that you want to be. But if it's a family member, we can't always leave. And if it's a partner relationship, there may be it's so complex. We just have to understand. The more we can understand perhaps why they're doing it because they don't have the emotional range, they don't have the capacity to own and to speak kindly. They're doing it because they don't they've reached their limit and they're exploding. The less personally we take it, the more we can come back to being neutral, the more we can see that it's just an emotional explosion of their toxicity, the easier it is for us to manage. And if we, as we talked about before, if we can change how we think about this, if we can change it to, wow, they're having an emotional outburst, and let that calm down, and then address any of the issues that may be valid, but that underlying the situation at later date where things have calmed down, then we can change how we feel about it because we're thinking about it differently. We're seeing it as an emotional explosion that sits with them. We can feel about it differently because we don't take it so personally. We can change therefore how we respond because we don't have to be hurt. We can just be, wow, they're really suffering. I understand you're really suffering at the moment. I'm going to give you some space, willing to talk about this when you've calmed down. And if we can change how we feel, then it just makes things more manageable. We don't have to be knocked sideways every time this happens. We don't have to run into the thoughts of, that's so unjust, that's so unfair. Why is he doing? Actually, you know what? Why are they doing it? They're doing it because they're struggling. Does it make it okay? And it helps us deal with it. Helps us come back to our hallowed ground of neutrality that we keep talking about. Sending you lots of love. You've got this.